Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Darren, we are in the middle of June. We just passed the summer solstice, the longest day of daylight in the year, at least on the where we live. And it was a hot one here. I don't know if it was hot down where you were, but it's definitely getting warmer. And I enjoyed it. I got a little sunshine. It was really nice. And I've been kind of falling back into the routine. And I say that because I just got back from your retreat that took place out in Northern California. Had a wonderful time last weekend with you and everyone else who attended. It was a really beautiful setting. I'd never been to that part of the country before. I wasn't sure I was going to make it. My flights were delayed due to rain. And so there was times where I was like, oh man, maybe this isn't going to happen. Maybe it's not meant to be. But fortunately, when every flight is delayed, you still end up getting there. So while I did get into Sacramento super late and got very little sleep, I was able to make it up to the retreat. And once I was there, I had a truly wonderful time with everybody. And looking forward to talking about that with you as we kind of reflect a little bit on what that experience was like, both for you and for me. And also to dive into some of the aspects that I think came out of the retreat and things that we've talked about before, but on maybe exploring more of the contours of that experience. So first of all, let's check in with you. How are things going? And have you found yourself able to kind of get back into the groove since the retreat? I know you only got back pretty recently because you spent a couple of extra days out there, but how are things with you?
Yeah, it was a great experience for me as well. And like you said, I just got back in a couple of days ago because I used to live in the Sacramento Valley. I spent a bit more time both beforehand and afterwards before I came back. Found that really interesting just in terms of reflecting, tuning into that part of my life and seeing it with more context now was really interesting. And I'm happy to be home, back in the cabin, back in the Blue Ridge, because I was, as you know, 3 trips in a row. In April, I was in Houston. In May, I was in Denver. And in June, now in the Shasta area and other parts of California. And each of those trips were about a week long. We're not quite a week in Denver, but they were close to that. So as you know, when you come back, you adjust to being back home. And I'm actually thankful at this point. There's nothing planned for July. Just looking forward to being here and reflecting on some of the amazing experiences we had. This was the second retreat I've done. I did one last year in Idaho, which was also an amazing experience. And probably half of the group that was in Shasta, which was a bigger group, 20 people, were also at the retreat in Idaho. And it was amazing to see people come together, just see alchemically how much potential was in the room just before we even began. And then it becomes much more about channeling the energy that wants to emerge. And as you know, we synchronistically had numerous really fascinating things happen throughout the weekend. It felt very enchanted, which is very much the kind of experience we were looking for. But before I reflect a bit more on my takeaway, I'm curious for you coming in, having not had that experience before. I'm not sure how long ago it was that you had a retreat experience of any kind, but tell me more about your experience and what you came away with.
Yeah, I was really surprised, honestly, at how easy it was to get into that groove with a room full of basically 18 strangers, people that I didn't know. It was a pretty good-sized group, a lot of different backgrounds that were represented, and people from all over the country were there. And I found it just really amazing how easy it was for people to share, and I should say, in a room full of self-proclaimed introverts. They were all pretty open and willing to talk and share their experiences. And what I found to be very powerful about that is that the potential for that kind of connection is really everywhere. You know, clearly these are people that have an interest in exploring these topics and have participated in some of your classes before and are a little bit familiar with each other, and the cadence of those interactions was more familiar to them. But even all that aside, I think that in the right settings, with the right intention, with the right willingness, you can get a room full of pretty much anybody to really be open and share and be more authentic with one another. And that really does lead to, as you said, this beautiful alchemical transformation of energy that takes place in a group like that. And, you know, I want to acknowledge that in these kinds of circles, we tend to use language that sounds from the outside, I think, pretty wild. It's like talking about alchemy, and we're talking about energy, and some people talk about frequencies. And, if you're in Northern California, maybe all that stuff sounds totally normal. But for those of us from the deep South or whatever, this is not in our lexicon of things that we are familiar with or comfortable talking about. And I want to just sort of acknowledge that while that may be true, there are absolutely parallels to those experiences in other traditions. So if you come from a more sort of typical Western Christian perspective, you're used to being in, probably prayer groups, or you've done youth group retreats, or you've done mission trips or things of that nature. A lot of the things that take place in those efforts are very similar, or at least can be mapped onto things that take place in a retreat that doesn't talk about that, doesn't have the trappings of Christianity. I think that's important, right? Because it speaks to the fact that that language is a very powerful tool, and we have to be careful and cognizant of how that is used, and also recognize where people kind of what foreign countries people come from in their own religious and spiritual journeys, and kind of acknowledge those things, and then work together to find that space where real transformative conversation and connection can take place. And of course, there's people who have no religious traditions whatsoever, so where all of this stuff is going to look very strange and foreign and perhaps even off-putting, right? So then the language that they have, the most familiar language they can bring to that experience, is one of a therapeutic environment. I'm used to talking with a therapist, and I know, this is discussing my feelings and my insights, or these kinds of things that maybe they won't talk about with their friends or their coworkers. So there is something that we can share together, and it's just about finding that time and that space, and finding that cadence. And I feel like that the retreat really offered opportunities for that, and again, how easy it was to get into that, and then how time had a way of slowing once we found that rhythm with the group. The few days that we were there honestly felt like a week, and that was really great for me, just to step away from the routine of daily life and really sit in that experience. So I really thank you for kind of setting that up, and it was just a great time all around.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think that was the general takeaway for most of the people there. And, while on the one hand, as you say, what we recognize is that most people could actually come together and have a really profound experience like this, because, of course, we share so much in common. And often in our society, we talk about what makes us different. And right now, there's a lot of cultural conflict, and people talk about different groups of people and what they tend to believe in their worldviews. But there's also undeniably something about us being human that we share so much in common. And we touched on this in the retreat, that to some degree, we are each other, reflecting to each other as mirrors, different aspects of the same experience. And that's really profound and can be really experientially rich. And I think we tapped into that on the weekend. As you pointed out, everybody there, except for one, had taken one of my classes. That was somebody's spouse who came along and did really well and had a great experience too. But because everyone had taken at least one class, several of them had taken multiple classes. Therefore, there was some familiarity amongst people already, and a familiarity with practicing radical transparency, for instance, which is something that is at the core of the Essence of Being initiative. And so the fact that people were ready to drop in the very first night was really profound for me. And as you know, this has been part of an ongoing conversation around what might this evolve into in terms of perhaps a permanent intentional community/retreat center. And I feel very called to both more regularly offer these kind of opportunities for people to dip their feet in, if you will, these deeper aspects of reality, and then be able to return to their normal lives, quote unquote, but also allow a more immersive kind of experience as well, where there might be people who come and are senior students that are there for a year or two, living there and really working into the deep layers of the self. And I think some people who would want to live in that kind of community ongoingly. So this particular intentional community that seems to be coming together will offer a certain kind of ingredient mix for people that want this particular kind of growth experience. And I'm sure, as you and I have been talking about, many other people will begin to experiment with intentional community and just communal living in general. And as you pointed out, this reminds many of us, and we brought this up at the retreat, many of us as children or teenagers or young adults were part of different faith communities. And we touched on the fact that once you move away from organized religion, there really is nothing in our society to replace that with. So most people, again, spend a lot of time online, but as you pointed out on one of the mornings to me, it's so different when you're with people in person. It feels much more multidimensional. So yes, both reflecting on our days in college, living on campus with community and faith communities we've been a part of, each of those are kind of early reflections of what this could be. And it's really exciting to see what's going to emerge. I'm looking forward to doing more of these. The other thing that happened that I think is really important for us to point out is that there were really remarkable synchronicities that arose over the weekend, where you really are tapped into the sense that this group coming together with shared intention begins to interact with reality in such a way, and this will relate to what we're going to unpack today, reality begins to render differently. And it's like as we turn our attention to the field and become very intentional about it, then that field begins to reflect back to us and mirror back to us. And then you get these kind of feedback effects when numerous people are interacting. So that was really fascinating to watch. As you know, Blue Jays and Red Cardinals came out time and time again. Just really fascinating things that give you major insights experientially into a different way of experiencing and understanding reality. So that also is really fascinating. And while that also happened in the classes to some degree, there does seem to be something about when you come together alchemically, something forges that couldn't otherwise. Last thing I'll touch on really quickly, even though this was not meant to be a CE5 retreat or a heist retreat, right? We're there to investigate consciousness and tapping into deeper aspects of ourselves and this kind of fractal patterning of reality, which we'll get into today and unpack again. But that said, on a couple of the nights, people did gather to Skywatch after we had sort of finished our time in the Mother Yurt together. And on the Friday night, which is the first night that we were there, I had a really profound experience with Molly Johnson, who was at the retreat with us. And we had gone out there to potentially Skywatch, but we were also engaged in conversation. And I want to make this distinction so that people understand what actually provides the opportunity for these kinds of experiences to arise. Because we didn't follow the usual CE5 protocol or heist protocol. We didn't meditate beforehand. We hadn't necessarily set a really strong intention. That said, though, because we had just been practicing radical transparency in the Mother Yurt together, that already kind of set the tone. And then when I was out there talking with Molly, at some point we were looking up and tracking different things. Is that a satellite? Is that a planet? What is that? And at some point we just fell into this deeper rhythm of talking about an experience I had the previous summer with my friend Carly, who is my primary radical transparency partner. We've pursued this for hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week for 3 years now. So you tap into really, really subtle levels of reality. And as I was describing that experience that I had with Carly to Molly, so we're in that experience, right, tapped into that deep level of reality. And that's when we noticed this thing manifest in the sky. It was like a yellow-white light. I say yellow because the stars look very much like a pure white. This was yellower than that. It was quite large. It was basically the largest thing in the sky. And you're kind of drawn out of your conversation. You're looking up and you're both kind of recognizing what is that thing. And that wasn't there 30 seconds ago, right? And we both recognized it. Then it basically faded out of existence. It didn't go somewhere. It didn't go behind a cloud. It was a clear night. It just faded out of existence. And to me, and Molly was on the same page, this was very much arising as an implication of the deep field consciousness experience we were having in our conversation, which just goes to show that you can, with an intention, set the dynamics for your interactions, and that also taps into these other consciousnesses and how they show up. Super fascinating. And I remember talking to Molly the last morning, so on the Monday morning before we all left to go home, and she talked about this ringing in her left ear that came in like a tuning that happened at the same time we were seeing the object, right? Because this is something else people are aware of. Both Molly and I have tinnitus in our left ear, but this shows up as something different. It's a different kind of tone, and it feels like a kind of a tuning that's happening based on this relational experience you're having with some other aspect of reality. Because we say different aspects of the self, we talk about different interactions with different beings or different kinds of consciousness. But of course, at the most ultimate level, all of this is us. So there is no separation between what is manifesting in the environment and who we are. Those are just different fractal levels of the same thing. And when you have an experience like this, it helps drive that home in a way that really changes your understanding of reality. Really profound, had everything to do with the fact that I was with Molly and having this particular conversation, the fact that she's able to drop into a deep level. All of this is really fascinating as we begin to step into this new world beyond just congressional engagement on this topic. And we begin to ask deeper questions about what does this mean for the nature of reality, a phrase that we've said many times on this podcast, especially over the last year. But this is what comes to the fore, and this is exactly what I hope that we will unpack today.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get into that quite a bit. And I want to echo that. It was, it definitely transformed the way that reality was experienced. And there was this truly fascinating exchange of information and experience amongst the participants in the group that led to just synchronicity after synchronicity, not just during the time that we were there, but even afterward. I continued to have some, and even just a few minutes ago, I actually had another one, some really interesting ongoing synchronicities to things that we touched on. And it's, we talked about synchronicity before, and sometimes people can get hung up on the specific symbol, whatever that might be, and kind of lose sight of what that really points toward, right? So it points toward this deeper connectivity of meaning in reality than, oh, I should go and become a cardinal aficionado or something, like birdwatch cardinals all day long. Like that's not the message per se, right? It's something else. So we're going to get into that a lot more. And I want to point out as well, you kind of hinted to this, that we didn't really talk about UFOs for most of the retreat. Honestly, most of the retreat was about consciousness and exploring the contours of experience. And UFOs are very much kind of an afterthought, quite frankly, just something that we would try to check at the evening hours, just watch the sky, see what we see, and then go to bed. So it was quite interesting in that way. But speaking of UFOs, there is a lot of stuff going on in that space, as there always is. And I know we want to talk a little bit about some of those things before we dive into the meat of the episode. So there have been some recent developments in ufology. We'll just kind of go through some of these, not in any particular order, but the first one that I've got here, Darren, is the footage that we saw from Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp of this disc or sphere object that is sort of flitting between clouds or above clouds, inside of clouds. And really interesting footage. It's perplexing. I don't think we've seen anything quite like this in the footage releases that have happened thus far. So very, very interesting material there. We heard that alluded to, certainly from Matthew Brown, and we knew that Corbell had seen that footage as he had spoken about it in that interview with Matthew Brown, but actually having released it now, really, really interesting. And hopefully that kind of leads lawmakers to get more curious and try to push for additional hearings. So, no, Corbell has said that he's got 3 firsthand witnesses that are ready to testify if lawmakers have the spine to do that. So, it'll be very interesting to see how that develops. But Darren, what were your thoughts on that footage?
Well, first of all, I'll say, along with other people, that it was pretty compelling footage. It was less blurry and amorphous than some of the footage we've seen. And interestingly, I think a lot of people were excited about the fact that it looked initially, or is identified initially, as a disc, right? So we've talked more recently about orbs and tic tacs and black triangles, but this was the sort of standard stereotypical disc that we saw referenced more in like the 20th century in terms of ufology. Now, since then, it's come out that it might actually be more like a sphere. It's unclear if it's actually a disc, and there seems to be some examination of the footage that suggests it even kind of changes shape a little bit, like it's adjusting in the environment it's in. So it might not be a hard metallic kind of object, but something maybe more organic again, almost like a soft shell, like an egg or something, but definitely looked round. And something else that caught my attention was the fact that, yes, it seems to almost look like it's darting between clouds. And those of you who saw that film Nope will recognize that from that film. Very nostalgic in a sense of like that. Definitely made me think about that film. Almost like you could, again, without trying to create overlay, but you could make the argument that it speeds up to go from one place where it's hidden behind a cloud to be hidden in another one, pauses there, and then changes direction and moves back diagonally again in a different direction. So If it's something like a balloon that the skeptics and debunkers would like to suggest, then you have to entertain notions of major wind gusts changing direction and those kinds of things, because it definitely does change direction. It looks like it's being directed with intelligence. And perhaps most importantly, and this is something that both Jeremy and George pointed out, this has been officially categorized as UAP by the US government. So again, you get the Mick West of the world who immediately try to break it down and say it's this or it's that. But of course, the US government has access to all the sensor data related to that event, and they consider all of that before they will categorize something as UAP. And again, just to make the point, 99.9% of things they observe do not get classified as UAP because either the footage itself makes it clear what it is, or the corroborating data from other sensor systems helps clarify what it is. But after considering all of that, right, all those different kinds of data, they concluded this was a UAP. So very fascinating. Now, of course, as many people argue, why can't we have better quality footage? Why can't we have HD footage? It's 2025. We find out from Jeremy that this was actually likely filmed from something like a cell phone office screen. Like you do see some glare. So it's like footage of footage of footage, like 3 levels down kind of thing. But understandably, that's probably because the actual footage is probably classified. So incredibly fascinating. I really found this quite compelling. I saw some people who do basically forensic analysis of footage initially going, wow, this almost looks like a black hole to me. Looks like it's warping space-time perhaps. Later on, that person backed off from that analysis once they realized that the third video is actually enhanced, right? So the challenge there is that you end up with artifacts that are not necessarily in the original footage, and we should clarify that for people. AI enhancement doesn't just clean up things, it actually sometimes adds things, hence the artifacts. So we're in this conundrum, right, where the initial footage is still kind of blurry and not HD, so it makes us want to have a clearer picture, but then when we use AI to do that, then we aren't any more confident that some of what's showing up isn't actually just an artifact of that process itself. So I found it compelling, definitely made me want to know more, and it was interesting to hear that they've been sitting on this for years, basically. They were waiting on making sure they're protecting people and whatnot before they revealed it. That was my take. What was your take from that footage as well?
Yeah, I agree. Very, very compelling, very interesting. I hope that leads to additional, sort of breakthroughs. I mean, I've gotten to this place, and I've mentioned this before, a little bit jaded on some of the footage that we keep getting. And you can go through that cycle of just footage and analysis and footage and analysis, and it never really gets anywhere. So, this one definitely jumps out as a very different looking object with no least obvious explanation to me. So be curious to see where that goes. And it reminded me that, we had recently a few interviews with Tim Phillips, who used to be, I think, the assistant director or interim director of Arrow. And he's been interviewed by Stephen Greenstreet and Mick West, people that are, strongly in kind of the debunker or skeptical crowd of UAP. And Tim's comments about some of the findings of Arrow were interesting in the sense that he confirmed that there are UAP that exist that we don't understand, and that isn't just low information zone footage that or stories like that. That includes high information zone footage. And I think Tim even directly sort of spoke to the fact that he thought this might represent a technological breakthrough from an adversary, which is quite concerning. And when Greenstreet asked him, what's one of the most interesting things that you've kind of come across, and he says, well, he kind of laughs about it. He's like, well, the black triangles. And I think, Greenstreet's reaction is quite interesting. He's like, are you serious? Like, are you just joking with me right now? Like black triangles? He's like, yeah, like the black triangles. They're strange. We've seen them. We've got a lot of different reports of them. And different, sort of analyses that have been conducted on them, but we don't really understand what they are. That's very interesting, and that's a lot more revealing than what we've been hearing from Arrow to date, and also a little bit contradictory to some of the statements that Phillips himself has made. He's been quite critical of some of the whistleblowers and the conclusions that they have come to about UAP, and yet here we have an individual that seems to think that, clearly think that they're real, been very close to those investigations. We don't have good explanations for them. And the conclusion that he's coming to is that this is just technology of unknown origin, which is very, very interesting. So it's about frameworks and, how do you, Tim being a very government guy, sort of looking at through the lens of threats and not something that's otherworldly. He's putting it firmly in the bucket of not our technology, but nevertheless technology from somebody else that is human. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and we'll see where that goes. I mean, it's certainly, this is not getting the conversation is not getting colder. It's only continuing to heat up, and I think hopefully, fingers crossed, we're going to see some further hearings about this soon and additional language that's introduced in the next NDAA that will hopefully get passed, and we'll get some additional traction on the disclosure front.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting with Tim Phillips is that, and this basically references something we're going to talk about later, and you kind of hinted at it, that we bring worldviews to the table always. And he made the argument and basically was self-confessing when Greenstreet said at some point, you think this could be aliens? He's like, well, I'm not going to go there. I don't want to go there, right? Like, he made it clear that until he has evidence that leaves that as the only option, he will not go there. He will stay with quote unquote conventional sources before he goes there. That said, he does acknowledge that it's not just vehicles that look strange, but they are performing in ways that we can't reproduce. And again, you think about the trillions of dollars that go into the U.S. defense budget. It's difficult to imagine too many foreign adversaries that would make a leap of this kind that we would just be completely unaware of. So while I understand that he's not wanting to go there yet, you can see what begins to look like cognitive dissonance in him and many others. And what this really comes down to ultimately is not just the notion of, is this human or is this something non-human, hence NHI, but deeper questions that we're going to get into again around what is the nature of reality. Is duality itself misleading us in terms of the nature of reality? And to what extent is our consciousness playing a role here? We're going to break all this down. And that's what's so fascinating about this topic, is that people get in by talking about nuts and bolts craft, trying to distinguish, is this China, is this Russia, is this Iran, is this alien, is this ET alien, is this interdimensional alien, is this sister humanoid species alien, is this us from the future, is this different fractal imaging of ourselves to ourselves as part of some multidimensional integration, as I kind of explored in the last POC episode. Fascinating the levels you go through and the levels you have to go through in a certain order, right? So that becomes fascinating. When you interact with people that are newer to this, they're not ready to go there. And I interact with people, for instance, when I was in Denver a month ago, where I could see that on the one hand, lights were going on, there was real curiosity, but there was also some clear psychological discomfort with how far some of the implications went. And I could tell some people were like pulling the reins back on the horses and saying, yo, metaphysical stallions, I'm not ready to go there quite yet. Let me walk this out bit by bit. But you can see inevitably where it's going to take people. Really, really fascinating. And I just want to add to that point that when I was at the Archives of the Impossible conference, there was a panel that Jeff did with a couple other people. And in that, there was one person who made a clear statement that he doesn't think these beings are the same beings that are referenced in different scriptural and religious traditions. But then, as the time went on, he began to share an experience he had as a young person. I think he was around 12 years old or something, when he had a really traumatic experience with a grandparent dying, passing away. And up until that point, he actually had a lot of metaphysical faith. He was a person who had been raised in a religious tradition and had basically this faith perspective on reality, that it was arising from some deeper spiritual, energetic level. There's those terms again. And he was so disillusioned by that experience that now he basically has pushed all of that away. So the reason I bring that up is to point out that we are not blank slates. We are bringing our history. We are bringing our difficult, painful experiences of history, including when we at one point were open to something being more meaningful and purpose-driven, and some event from life disillusioned us, and we walked away from that. And yet also seeing people come all the way full circle and beginning to engage with that again in light of what they're seeing through this phenomenon. That's why it's so fascinating, because it opens up all these other doors.
Yeah, I want to get Metaphysical Stallions on a t-shirt. That sounds really good. And speaking of Metaphysical Stallions, what kind of Metaphysical Stallions will it take, do you think, for the movie Age of Disclosure to finally hit a wider distribution. It's really quite strange. We haven't seen that. And it was introduced in March, and haven't heard a lot of news about it getting picked up by a bigger distributor. So really curious to see where that goes. And as you know, the content from that documentary, to a certain degree, has an impactful shelf life. So if it sits too long, it starts to get a little bit stale and loses some of its punch, which is a little bit concerning. So we've talked about it before. I guess we'll see where that goes. I haven't heard any rumors as to a release date or anything like that, but maybe the timing will just be perfect. Maybe it will hit the news cycle alongside some other important developments like additional hearings or a new legislative language. We can only hope. But what are your thoughts on that? What's the story there? Why do you think it's getting stalled?
Yeah, it is perplexing. And I legitimately thought after our last podcast episode, but that by the time we had another one, it would have been released, or we would at least know the release date or an approximate release date. But we seem no closer today than we were when we last recorded an episode, which is quite surprising because there is an understanding of marketing and marketing potential. And like you say, there is a shelf life of even interest and curiosity. And in our society, it's all about what have you done for me lately? And if this begins to be recognized as revelations that were recorded a year ago or more, then people begin to ask questions about, well, what's happening more recently? I don't know that I care about those things that happened a year ago. Interesting stuff, and we'll see. I haven't heard anything on the inside to explain it other than it's all about getting the right distribution deal. When will there be some sort of compromise where there's this recognition, okay, we're maybe not getting the deal we want, but it's important we get this out. And, I think about what happened with Leslie Kean when she was releasing that article about David Grush, and she was waiting on, is the New York Times going to publish this? Is the Washington Journal going to publish this? Is Politico going to publish this? And all three were in the picture. And eventually there was so much humming and hawing going from Politico and the Wall Street Journal where she began to recognize, are they really serious about publishing this, or are they just dragging their feet ongoingly? And she began to be concerned about the threats, legitimate threats against Dave Grush's health. That's when they decided, okay, we're going to publish in the debrief instead, much smaller paper, much less of a reach in terms of impacting public perspectives and that kind of thing. But that's what put them in that place where they had to make that decision. At what point will the producers of the Age of Disclosure film come to that same place where they might not be getting the distribution deal they were hoping for, but because of, again, the fact that this is going stale over time, perhaps they'll decide. We shall see. But speaking of that film, another interesting element that has emerged recently that I actually watched just yesterday was this interview with John Ramirez on Chris Ramsey's Area 52 channel. It was really interesting because John went into some detail that he has not gone into before. He also brought up Age of Disclosure, and he mentioned that he actually was interviewed for that for over 2 hours. And because they have so much footage, it turns out that all of his interview has basically been cut from the film. So he's not in the film at all. And ironically, he said some things in the film, apparently, that were going beyond what he said before, but he felt comfortable doing so because there were other representatives of the U.S. government, former and present, who were saying things that made him feel greater cover in that overarching umbrella of the film. But now he's not willing to say those things again outside of the context of that film and that kind of cover that he felt there. So that raises interesting questions. Will we eventually get producer's cut or something where we get the much larger film, longer film? I don't know. But I want to touch on some things that he said in this interview on Area 52 because there are some fascinating things that came up. We mentioned in our last podcast that an interview he had done alongside Jack Sarfati. He went into some more detail, again, talking about how he feels like, to some degree, he manifested his future. He, on the one hand, recognizes that he did have free will. He feels like he had free will, but at the same time, it was almost clear when he looks back in retrospect that he was going to end up working for the CIA. He talks about, as he did in that previous interview, basically envisioning himself like he was remembering the future, walking through the halls of the CIA building. And that does indeed happen later in his life. Now, he said some things that I found really, really fascinating, not because they're new to us, but because he's saying this has been confirmed from inside sources. So rather than this being conjecture on the UFO circuit, He's saying that this was stated within government and that it was a known thing and actually had been cataloged and explored within government. And two things he mentioned were hybrids are real, which is to say human-alien hybrids, beings that are a mix of their DNA and ours, are real. And not only are they real, but they're present on planet Earth as we speak. And the government is aware of certain family lines that have this anomalous DNA in their mix. That in itself is fascinating because people like Gary Nolan have said that if there were hybrids on the planet, we would know by now from their DNA. Well, here, basically, John is saying we do have that evidence, and the government's aware of who those people are. He went on to ask John, do you think you're a hybrid? Because John himself had really anomalous experiences when he was young. He's had the nosebleeds thing, the missing time thing, all that. He didn't want to come out and say that he was, but he recognizes that he's had some really interesting experiences. He's definitely an experiencer as we define that. So it's interesting listening to John because I think he brings both this esoteric understanding just because of his pure personal interest and experience, but he's also pairing that with what he heard and saw discussed within government circles. The other thing he's confirmed as real, based on actual evidence and data and conversations he saw being had in official circles, was implants, that these are known to be real. They've been apparently taken out, examined, and determined to be anomalous in some way. So what's your take, Nathan? I know you haven't watched that interview yet, but when you hear those two claims, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, I think I'm in a little bit of both camps. The camp that says, okay, John, that's great. I need more direct evidence of that. I do think John is a trustworthy guy. I value his opinions and his experience. So I weight that pretty heavily. So the other part of me is like, yeah, okay, that's good confirmation that this is, in fact, a real aspect to the phenomena. And we certainly heard many, many stories about hybrids and implants over the decades in ufology. So, kind of corroborating some of those stories that experiencers have shared about that is I think very, very powerful. Is it people often talk about is this the right time for that in the conversation? And we have a lot of conversations like that. Is this the right time to raise this aspect? But we've already been going down this path for quite some time already, with testimony from David Grush, certainly mentioning that, with Jake Barber and the Skywatcher group talking about psionics, and experiences there. I mean, these are facets of the phenomena that I think are part of the conversation now. And we're going to see how well or not that gets absorbed into the broader awareness of the subject. I think time will tell. But speaking of, sort of interesting developments and people that are central to the conversation at this moment and where we find ourselves in the world, we also had an interview with Ross Coulthart and Chris Bledsoe. And, Chris talking about the conflict between Iran and Israel and how that was kind of the precursor to orbs appearing and making themselves more known. And Chris feeling strongly that that's going to happen in 2026. And, again, bringing in kind of the conversation, the angels aspect of that phenomena that he's experienced. And, I wonder what your reaction is to that. That's certainly, it gets mixed reviews from the community, I would say, with Chris. Chris is a bit of a polarizing figure, as I think probably John is as well. But given the conflict that's taking place and the historical level of animosity between those two countries, is there anything unique in your mind about this particular time we find ourselves in, and any correlation between the conflict and the uptick in activity that might be seen of orbs or other kind of craft sightings?
Well, I think my answer will be complicated, not surprisingly. On the one hand, of course, I absolutely believe and see evidence for and have no problem entertaining the notion that there are metaphysical implications to what we see arising. That's one of the things we're going to unpack today. So in that sense, I think that Chris is on the right track when he's tapping into deeper realms of reality, different states of being that is in the picture. And in that sense, a term like angel helps people think about, based on their experience and their connotative kind of way of framing reality, that this is a level of being that is outside the traditional physical realm that we find ourselves in. And I think it's more complicated than that. And nevertheless, though, it's helpful that we are bringing in the metaphysical characters to the play because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are people who want to keep distinct the beings referenced in scriptural and historical religious traditions and what they see as extraterrestrials from this physical realm. But I think Chris is right that at least some segment of what we call NHI are these beings that we have historically understood as angels and demons. That doesn't necessarily mean that's a very helpful term or way of framing this, because that's, again, just a bunch of human beings drawing some conclusions and making some leaps in trying to frame this. And so you're still going to have people trying to fit these things into a pre-existing paradigm of reality. So we should point out, as we've done before in this podcast, but it often flies below the radar, that Chris himself is a human being who comes from a certain tradition. He comes from a Christian tradition where he was taught certain things about the world. So when he has anomalous experiences, he, like any human being, is going to feel the temptation, without recognizing it necessarily as a temptation, to want to slot it into that metaphysical understanding. I think sometimes when Chris says things like, these are angels, not aliens with ray guns, that is creating a kind of black and white possibility of space that I think doesn't offer enough nuance to what's actually going on here. Because one of the things I'm going to unpack later on is that these can both be alien beings as we understand it, and still being in service to some deeper metaphysical movements that are trying to happen from some higher fractal level. But that's a bit more complex and nuanced than just this dichotomy between ETs that are biological with ray guns and aliens that are coming from subsuming spiritual realm directly underneath God, and that kind of notion. So I'm glad the metaphysical aspect is being brought in, but I think sometimes the way it's being framed unnecessarily limits the possibility space. What's your take on that whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I have a similar perspective on that. And I think it can be quite frustrating. So I want to speak to where maybe a lot of people might find themselves at this juncture in the conversation when we're talking about how can something be real in the sense that, you know, my phone is real, it's a technology that exists in my waking state. But how could it also be metaphysical? So how could it be more than real? How could it represent something happening at a deeper level of reality? And I think for many people, even that distinction is off-putting or confusing. You know, how could something be physical and then metaphysical? Like, and maybe that those two things don't exist for them. Everything is physical. Physical is all that there is. Metaphysical is the world of imagination. Imagination isn't really real. It's a figment of the mind, right? So these are things that we've, of course, talked a great deal about over many, many episodes. If this is the first Liminal Phrames episode you're listening to, you probably want to go back and listen to some of those before we proceed further, because I think we are going to explore and analyze, is the boundary between physical and metaphysical an actual thing? Is there truly a distinction between what we call physical and metaphysical? And if there is no distinction between those things, what does that mean about the UFO experience? What does that mean about just lived experience, period, all experience? I think that's where it gets a lot more complicated and for many quite frustrating, because we want to be able to say, see, there it is. I can put it in a lab. I can analyze it under a microscope. It's real. And this notion that it could have a deeper symbolic meaning to it, like that just it's very, it can make people very uncomfortable because I don't want to explore, like if you're telling me there's a symbolism there, well, then it becomes quite a subjective exercise. What does it mean for Darren? What does it mean for Nathan? What does it mean for humanity? These are overlays that get sort of provided to that piece of technology that make the analysis of that, the objective understanding of that, much more complex, confusing, and perhaps even contradictory. And how can two things be contradictory but also both be true? Like these are aspects that I think we have to confront with the UFO phenomena, and I think we're gonna explore those contours in the next few minutes. So Darren, like, how can these things be both? How can it be both a technology but also a metaphysical reality or representation of a deeper reality? How do you understand those things to be in harmony with one another?
Well, I broke down some of this in my last POC episode. So just like Nathan just recommended for new people, they might want to go back and listen to former episodes. I would also recommend my episode number 115, where I basically talk about how synchronicity and astrology somehow track and comport with these other matters that we have typically put in this category of being physical and therefore more real. And yes, to your point a minute ago, not only do these other experiences feel substantive, but they actually feel hyper real to people. That's a really interesting term. How can something be hyper real? To your point, from a more dualistic framing, things are either real or they're not. It's either happening or it's imagination. But that's not what the data seems to suggest here. The data seems to suggest, not just from UFO contact experiences, but also near-death experiences and other phenomena in non-ordinary states, that there are experiential realms that people come into contact with that feel more real than this. The implication being, and I touched on this at the retreat in terms of my Christmas Day experience, you come back here and this feels not only less real, but in a way, not even real. It's somehow a virtual reality of sorts, which again, then people deal with, oh, so it doesn't matter, it doesn't count. It's like, no, it does count. And again, the underlying premise is if everything is basically just a manifestation or an excitation of consciousness that is showing up from these different vantage points and taking on temporary identities from those different vantage points, then all this is in play. And we need to, at a deeper level, challenge this dualistic framing of reality, even between subject and object, you and me, human and the alien. These are all, to some degree, different aspects of the same one being, and that these experiences arise that can both show up as initially positive or negative and still be arising for the sake of this kind of multidimensional integration that's trying to arise. And this is happening both individually, it's happening for you and I, it's happening for our community, and it's happening for human civilization. And people like Valet have talked about this, that the control structure might show up at such a point as to maybe even a kind of a programming way, or maybe it's even an organic response that arises in the cosmos itself, because again, there is no ultimate separation, that when we get too far along a certain faulty notion of reality, like reductionistic materialism, then data in the form of experiences arise so that we will reconsider and hopefully come into a more holistic, integrated understanding of this deeper reality where physics and metaphysics are both in play. And I just want to bring to the picture here someone like Rupert Sheldrake, who comes again from a traditional scientific perspective, but when he looks at data, he seems to suggest that things are not as clear-cut as we would make them. So for instance, he talks about, instead of talking about the laws of nature, he thinks we should talk about the habits of nature, suggesting again that consciousness plays a role in the way that reality manifests around us, and that our very framing and expectation of reality determines what reality reflects back to us, hence habits. So just like someone might be addicted to a certain substance, but eventually get to the point where they overcome that and they have a different experience as a result, in the same way, these laws of nature might just be long-running habits that as we begin to engage with different data that might be inputted deliberately to try to expand our understanding, then not only do we grow in our understanding, but reality begins to manifest differently. Different habits of nature begin to manifest. So this is where we're going. It's complex, it's nuanced, it is absolutely a brain breaker, but I think also, and this is something we touched on in the retreat, it also promises a much more enchanting understanding of ourselves and of reality. So let me begin by making a couple of statements about where we're going to go today and then get your take on that. So the way I frame this in the description for this episode is as follows. Are some UAP technological vehicles, with others being better described as deriving from consciousness, where the observer is instrumental in the manifestation? Are they, quote unquote, out there, or perceptual overlays, or something more interesting? So the question here strikes at the heart of the evolving discourse around UAP. And what I think we're going to introduce today is a hybrid kind of ontology, where some UAP are objective technological vehicles, although we're also going to unpack what objective exactly means later on. But we have to do this step by step. While others may be consciousness-mediated phenomena, perhaps co-produced by observer and phenomenon. So when you think about that description and you compare that to some of the conversations you see being had in other sectors of the UFO community and society in general, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, well, I think that it tracks with what I've observed in the conversations taking place in the UFO community and in society at large. We are moving into a reality that is a lot more malleable than we maybe thought before. So we're starting to ask these questions, both in our science and in our lived experience, and examine these deeper questions of what is real and what is true, what is objective truth. And we're finding as we explore that question further that the answer is much more mysterious than I think we once thought, that modernity and materialism, with its very clean, neat answers as to what reality is, are ultimately unsatisfactory to our, and they don't hold up to our examination and our explorations. And so I find that to be very appropriate, right? That we're coming along at a time in human civilization where the old answers are no longer valuable because they don't satisfy all of the questions, all of the experience. You know, just saying that everything is material is no longer satisfactory in the time that we find ourselves in, and that we can point to quantum physics as an example in our science where seems to be these assumptions seem to be failing. We can point to our own lived experience that we're starting to take experience much more seriously than we did before, and that's come about in part because of alternate states of consciousness that we're exploring in ways that we haven't explored before. This psychedelic renaissance comes to mind, and what does it mean to have those experiences? How real are they? And of course, we're seeing other areas as well with psi phenomena, things like the telepathy tapes. These confront us and confront our old assumptions about what is real, and begin to challenge us to stretch our understanding of what reality is. And as I examine where we are in the UFO conversation, it very much is, if I could phrase it in this way, it's playing out at both an individual level and a collective level. That there is an individual wrestling with the content of the UFO experience and the phenomenological experience, and there's a society-wide wrestling with the experience. And those two things have parallels to one another, and they kind of are, you can see that there's a coevolution taking place in that conversation at large. So it's very, very interesting to me, and I think we're heading in a more positive direction and taking all of this, the experience of life more seriously and what reality truly is. But it is, from a traditional lens, quite frustrating. I understand the appeal that I want it to just be a physical craft. I don't want it to have some other metaphysical reality. I'd rather it be much simpler, neater, tidy, kind of a black budget program that's just hidden from our view. And if we can just acknowledge its existence and bring a being out in front of us, now that makes things a lot simpler than, this could be, you're telling me these are sort of facets and contours of consciousness itself. What does that mean? We're not equipped, I would say, in Western circles to really wrestle with those questions. We don't have the tool set, and that's something that unfortunately we've got to develop if we really, I think, want to understand more about what this truly is.
Yeah, I hear you. Absolutely. And depending on how long people have been in this conversation and how deep they've gone in the rabbit holes, will determine how much of the picture they're really taking into consideration. But I just want to point out that what we're saying here is basically this data does exist. There are some people who will claim, I don't see the data. But number one, they're making the assumption, therefore, that only one kind of data counts. And sometimes, even if there is other data, their preference for a certain model of reality will prevent them from even wanting to go in that direction. So I've seen, for instance, various debates that have been held where someone who's coming more from an idealistic perspective debates a physicalist. And we find that the physicalists didn't even bother reading any of the material from the idealistic perspective because they've just assumed a priori that this can't be real. So the entitled perspective that physicalism still holds in our modern world is very dominant. And if there's data that is challenging that more than any other, it is the UFO phenomenon. As you pointed out earlier, at the retreat, it was really about consciousness and how we engage with consciousness and develop our own movement as a kind of soul that is at this kind of fractal level again, an oversoul and many refractions below that. But interestingly, many of the people, of course, there, UFOs have been the mechanism by which they've now come across this deeper engagement with consciousness. I was having these conversations about consciousness in my integral circles and different spiritual circles decades ago. I had no idea in the future that UFOs would be the mechanism, and yet that's what's happening. So it's really fascinating, and it's fascinating that it's happening to different degrees at these different layers of our society. All right, so let's break this down a little bit so we can put on the table everything that's involved here so people can understand where we're going in the unpacking. So on the one hand, we do have evidence for what seem to be technological craft, nuts and bolts, in other words. This includes radar data, infrared tracking, multiple independent witnesses, and flight dynamics beyond known human capabilities. This all suggests that some UAP are physical, advanced, and likely non-human technology. These behave like structured craft. They leave traces, interact with the air and water, and exhibit inertia-defying acceleration, traits we associate with material engineering, hence these reverse engineering programs. And yet, there's also what appears to be consciousness-derived phenomena. What do we mean by that? So other UAP, again, other is the key word there because there's often a lot of conflation that happens here. Other UAP appear to engage subjectively and symbolically. They respond to thought or emotion. They appear during altered states, which you referenced a while ago. So CE5 is itself a kind of altered state because it involves meditative practice, for instance. They manifest inconsistently or in forms meaningful to the particular observer. That also arises in things like synchronicities that we mentioned on the weekend. What do UFOs have to do with blue jays and red cardinals? Well, a lot more than you might first think is the case. So this supports the idea that some UAP emerge from or interact with human consciousness itself, behaving less like machines and more like archetypal or synchronistic events. Again, that makes me think of my last POC episode. So in light of this, I just want to contrast what's happening here. So at the height of physicalism, because we're actually a fair ways beyond that, it's beginning to diminish, although it's still hard to track that sometimes. But at the height of the physicalist movement came this notion of logical positivism, also known as logical empiricism. So let's state this so we just see how plainly the data seems to violate this. So logical positivism or empiricism is a philosophical movement that emerged in the early 20th century, primarily amongst a group of thinkers known as the Vienna Circle. And its central tenet, Nathan, was that only statements that are empirically verifiable or logically necessary are meaningful. So only things you can empirically verify are meaningful and ultimately what they would call real. So this is where we are. We are recognizing not just that there seems to be nuts and bolts craft and other kinds of experiences that we also call UAP that seem to be involving consciousness more. But of course, you and I both know that even those distinctions get blurry over time because we have notions like telepathy, for instance. When people interact with the beings piloting those mechanical craft, they find that they can hear their voices inside their heads, right? There's no need for talking. There's no concerns about, do you understand English? There seems to be some deeper common ground that allows them to communicate with us. We sometimes think about that in terms of technology, but I think the bigger implication is that somehow, again, we're all mirrors of the same one being. And therefore, when we speak from that level, then we can actually all understand each other. Furthermore, even when you're interacting with these beings in nuts and bolts craft, they will talk about, experiencers often talk about, the beings seem to know their entire history, knew everything about them. And the experiencers often talk about this uncanny and, to some degree, discombobulating experience of also knowing these entities in a deeper, more intimate way than they had known any human being in our frame. So, give me some reflections there, not just about the fact that there seems to be two different kinds that get lumped into UAP, but even distinctions there seem to break down under further scrutiny.
Yeah, I think if I explore and if I reflect on a lot of the reactions to those experiences, from a materialist perspective, it often can be quite dark, because the conclusions that you hear people come to, if they are hardcore materialists in wrestling with those experiences, are essentially that there's a technology that they use to read our minds, that they've been observing us our whole lives like we're kind of rats in a cage, that we are, and you hear these things talked about in social media quite a bit, they cannot be trusted, we are their experiment. All of these things are quite dark, and they are overlays that we're bringing with us into that experience, because we have things that we do as human beings that mirror those kinds of experiences, right? So we have lab experiments we do on animals, and we do it for our good, not for theirs per se. And sometimes we do it for their good, but the animals don't know that it's for their benefit, right? So you see a lot of this mapping take place when you have that strict materialist perspective. But if you explore that further, and if you wrestle with the implications of things that we've been talking about, the implications of quantum field theory, for example, that there really aren't discrete particles in the world, that there are these tiny billiard balls that kind of bounce off of each other and create chain reactions and things of that nature. And the hard problem of consciousness, how does consciousness arise from those interactions? We have no real meaningful model to explain that. If you begin wrestling with these things, then you realize that reality is not at all what it appears to be, right? That's sort of where we're going with the on the frontier right now. The reality of what we experience is a kind of overlay, a kind of illusion, but a useful one, right? It's a useful symbolic representation of something deeper happening beyond our immediate perception. And so once you begin kind of chasing that a little bit further, then instead of coming to the conclusions that the materialist comes to oftentimes about this being technology and a reduction, of our agency, and we're kind of an experiment of these higher beings and yada, yada, yada. Instead of following that trail, we begin to pursue a different one altogether, which speaks at the interconnected nature of reality. And it does better explain, I think, the way in which these interactions take place, the more imaginal kind of aspects of them, that there is communication happening that is beyond technological, but it is more innate, more foundational than technology. So this becomes really very interesting, because it's not just an external thing that's happening. It's not a subject-object relationship anymore. It's all subject. It's all subjective. And that changes how we view the craft, how we view the experiences, how we view the understandings. But I think even with all that said, it can be very, very challenging, right, for the average person who's just kind of stepping their toes into the waters of UFOs. Like, this is not a language. This is not a framework that any of us are really familiar with, even though we've encountered it, right? So in the West, we've brushed up against these contours a good bit, but we're not masters of that by any means. And so it can be very confusing and disheartening, and you oftentimes see people just throw their hands up in the air. I don't want to deal with this anymore, because unless I can get the craft in front of me, then I'm done. I'm done with UFOs. It's all just, it's all in the mind. Everybody's crazy. I'm going to go back to what I can understand and analyze, right in front of me under the microscope. That's the reality that I want to limit myself to. But I will say, those who've chosen that path, it's not like they have to stop wrestling with the experiences that they have in the world, because the world confronts them with strange things, even with that determination. So ultimately, you're going to have to come back around and address this. You're going to figure out what it means for you. I just think that the idealist explanation is the most meaningful one, that kind of summarizes or encapsulates all of these experiences the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's helpful to recognize here that what we're distinguishing here is different layers of reality that manifest slightly differently, but they are at the same time both logically consistent as one fractal frame, but also embedded within almost this series of Chinese boxes that fit together. And that, to your point earlier about subject and object, when you recognize that everything is subject, I would say that what radical transparency has offered to me is this ability to, in greater and greater ways, to deeper and deeper levels, more and more subtle levels of reality, to decouple subject and object. And when you can know something about yourself now as an object and you can know it, then you can evolve beyond it. And then you drop into a more subtle level. Because the real implication here is that it's not just that these beings are really complex and fluid, and some of them seem to be spiritual and some physical and some seem to be some hybrid nature of the two, but we ourselves are multidimensional beings. This is something we've been saying for a while. But this is something that has to be unpacked over and over again and in greater detail so that people can have an experiential understanding of what that actually means. When we hear Congress people saying, yeah, I agree with David Grush, I think these might be interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial, that's fascinating in itself from a sociological point of view, that term is being introduced to the congressional discussion. But as we've said before, there needs to be this deeper engagement with what does that actually mean? It doesn't just mean different physical universes existing in a multiverse, as some might assume. It means that what we call physicality is just one way that consciousness is manifesting. And this also relates to what you were saying a minute ago about the fact that we don't really even have particles existing as things. What they actually are when we observe them as particles is excitations of this underlying interconnected field, this undifferentiated field that starts sounding a lot like what non-dual traditions talk about. Even mystical Christianity talks about this nature of reality. So again, it's super fascinating that physics, astronomy, neuroscience is all driving us in this direction. And to that point, one of the reasons why I land, without fully landing, but I lean strongly towards idealism as a model of reality versus something like panpsychism, which some people have asked me, why not take a panpsychist approach? And that's because with panpsychism, the notion is that mind is everywhere, but there's still a belief in the physical nature of reality. So in panpsychism, every particle or system, from electrons to rocks, may possess some rudimentary form of experience, self-identity, basically, self-awareness. What is it like to be an electron? The assumption there is that that might be something. But the problem, of course, and this goes all the way up to who we are, is that electrons aren't actually things. Rocks aren't actually things. Nathan isn't actually a thing. Nathan is an excitation of consciousness, just as an electron is, just as a rock is. Nathan, from an oversoul level, having multiple lifetimes, that's basically reflecting on different excitations of the undifferentiated field that is overarchingly subsuming everything else. So this becomes really fascinating. And this is why you end up back in this picture of all we can say is that everything is consciousness. That the things we look at, even the things that seem like they have no self-awareness, that seem like inanimate objects, quote unquote, versus things like my cat that seems to definitely have a self-identity. What we are seeing here is just different reflections from the one self, the ultimate mind, creating experiences in different wavelengths across myriad forms so as to explore itself and know itself in a way it cannot through just abstract reasoning. And this also relates to what I am encouraging for people and that we in the West really need to embrace. And that's this notion that there's a difference between this kind of gnosis, this direct knowing, this direct experience of reality, and abstractly reasoning about it. While abstract reasoning is helpful, and it's a tool we should use, we go far astray when we assume that's how we actually make sense of a reality that's out there and objective to us. So these are complex notions, and you kind of have to warm up to them over time and experience them as well before they become something you can actually say you know. But I just want to emphasize that something has really shifted in my perspective over the last couple of years, where gnosis has become so central to my experience and my understanding of reality. And I understand a lot of postmodern Western people trained in universities are going to cry foul there, because they will claim there is no ultimate reality. There's just perspectives that are derived from our experience and our biases and our prejudices. And that's why postmodernism also, often as a correction for modernism, will try to point out that there is no ultimate truth. There's just perspectives. Now, there's some aspect of that that's true, that we are taking on these temporary forms, where these temporary excitations of consciousness, and therefore understanding from that perspective is going to be different. It's going to be skewed, and they're all equally real in a way. But nevertheless, we simultaneously are not only those temporary excitations, we are also still the field below that, and many fractal levels in between that field and who Nathan is and who Darren is. And what radical transparency offers as a path is a way to experience yourself on each of those different fractal levels. And you're able to pull out different elements of reality as a result. So this is not just something that's entertaining and a nice notion. It sounds exciting. You could write a cool sci-fi script based on this. It really fundamentally changes who we are and how we experience ourselves in reality.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of threads I want to pull on there. Just like the title of the show, liminal frames, right? They're different frameworks that we can choose to use to examine experience. And I find that understanding that concept itself is useful, because the ability to examine experience from different frames is valid. Like the frameworks themselves are useful. So there is a sense in which, can think about it almost like, I don't want to say a kaleidoscope, but some kind of, a device that you're using to look at the world, right? And if you put a certain, if you've ever been to the optometrist, they put the lens in front of you and they say, is A clear or is B clear? Is it A, or B and C? You're flipping back and forth. And depending on your state, A is clear or B is clear. And then your state changes as you get older. Those of us who've gotten older understand this. B becomes clear and A becomes less clear, right? So it's important to kind of take that concept of frames and use that to deepen your understanding of the self, of the world, because there are frames by which we can find meaning in the world that are incredibly valuable, but they are very subjective. They are rooted in a subjective experience, such that if I use the same frame in a different subjective state, they are no longer meaningful. That they lose their efficacy, right? So this is true about reality, right? We can use these frames to examine the experiences that we have, whether they be the concept of physicality that the UFO craft present, or the concept of non-physicality that, say, an orb or an NDE represent to us. We can use those interpretive lenses and glean meaning about the deeper truths of reality, and they're all meaningful. They all have their own value, right? So I think it's understanding that. But that practice takes place all in the mind, right? So that vantage point where I say, this is physical, this is imaginary, these are just sort of clothes that I step into at a given moment and experience. And I think it gets very challenging, right? So this takes a lot of work, to be honest. It takes a lot of introspection, a lot of exploration, a lot of failure, a lot of willingness to try and to hold things in suspension. These are all practices that we are uncomfortable undertaking, but they do enrich the experience. And so, to kind of bring it down to something that is very, I think, very practical. When we were at the retreat and we're sitting around, we're all sharing experiences of our lives, and everyone's kind of going through a certain anecdote that they have, and then the next person shares, right? The next person shares. What you begin to see, if you choose to see it, is the deep, interrelated, interconnected nature of all of those experiences with your own lived experience. And so they then become facets of the same diamond, like they become facets of this deeper symbolic object that is the self, but is also the world. It's yes and, it's both and. And so I find that to be incredibly meaningful for me, because it begins to challenge notions of who I think I am. It challenges my understanding of who I think others are, of our relationship with one another, our relationship to the planet, our relationship, to our families. It impacts all of these things. And the craft, we can get so self-absorbed in the craft, in that one iteration of the experience. It's like me getting obsessed with the microscope and how cool it is I can use the microscope to see the deeper reality. And I could get so obsessed with the microscope that I just choose to ignore the fact that there is deeper reality happening all around me. I just care about getting a better microscope. It's a little bit it's a little bit fake feeling, and it's putting something between me and the actual experience, right? And it's elevating that thing between above the experience itself. So for me, it's very challenging work, and in the UFO community, with all the things that happen and disclosure and the emphasis on that, like I can see I can get wrapped up in that, and I want to say it's okay to get wrapped up in that, but that's not really the whole enchilada, so to speak.
Absolutely. And people riding metaphysical stallions definitely eat metaphysical enchiladas. But on this note, I'd like to go one level deeper as we get into the final segment here and unpack this in one more level, but also remembering the other levels, because these are all simultaneously true. Like you said, it's both and, not either or. So in addition to nuts and bolts craft that show physical traces that we can measure that appear to be manifesting in the physical world, quote unquote, and in addition to the fact that we have this consciousness-derived kind of interface or communication that happens across different levels of consciousness among different kinds of beings, we also have a multidimensional understanding of the self again and how this plays in. And this brings to mind what I referenced earlier when we try to create this dichotomy between angels coming from a spiritual realm and aliens with ray guns coming from Alpha Centauri, that assumes that that's one or the other. But not only is that duality, I think, called into question with the true data here, the fullness of the data, but what we understand also is that those can be happening simultaneously, and they're each driving different levels of meaning and integration. I use the analogy when you and I were discussing this before we started recording, that as human beings, we actually are not good at multitasking. We might think we're great multitaskers, but what we actually do is I do A. Now I switch and I do B. But we are following this one perspective at a time, and then we switch over. We don't function in parallel very well at all. And as a programmer, I was aware that when you can have a multi-threaded kind of programming environment, then you can do multiple things at the same time, much more powerful. What AI can do is it can consider a billion variables at the same time when it's coming up with a solution. I would argue that reality is manifesting like that all these fractal levels are not only coexisting, but they are interpenetrating, and they are each driving their own kind of agenda based on that particular notion of consciousness and the self that exists in different ways across those different fractal levels. So in that sense, the aliens with ray guns might actually be functioning like aliens with ray guns, but they may also be part of what we see as a more angelic or spiritual overtone that's trying to integrate some deeper understanding of metaphysical truth. Like all of this can be happening simultaneously. So it's both and to the max, basically. So on top of what we talked about already, we also just want to quickly insert here our discussions around Donald Hoffman, because not only is physical reality not all there is, but Donald Hoffman has been really helpful to demonstrate that what we perceive through our senses is actually not reality anyway. It's an interface already translating a much more complex, overarching kind of structure of reality, which may not be spatial temporal at all. So let's finish with this thought. So reflecting on the earlier conversation about a plural ontology behind UAP events, in other words, some are physical, some seem to be consciousness derived, and of course it goes deeper than that, and going further with Hoffmanian insights, how do we also wrap in the notion, so often attested to in NDEs and regression sessions, that at some higher fractal level, we are choosing the events of our lives for the sake of catalytic opportunities they represent? So this question basically synthesizes three powerful threads that in society, these conversations tend to be happening independently. But what I think that data is asking us to do is to consider all of them and how their interaction, how their relationship tells us something really profound about reality at a deeper level. So the first of these is a plural ontology of UAPs, suggesting that some are technological vehicles, while others are consciousness-derived phenomena, co-created or modulated by the observer's mind. Again, we can break that down even further. Then we've got Hoffman's interface theory, positing that what we perceive as reality is actually a user interface evolved for survival, not truth. Objects, quote unquote, and space-time itself are more like icons, not the actual territory. Finally, NDEs and regression insights point to a higher order self that selects life experiences for growth, learning, or soul evolution, often catalyzed through challenge, mastery, and mystery or transformation, including challenges such as dealing with apparent non-human intelligences. So, bringing this all together suggests a multi-layered ontology of experience in which we see these as interface disruptors, and there's co-created phenomena at the root of reality itself. So we have to get past thinking about them as other. In many ways, this is the other as the self, or the self as other, if you think about it this way. And ultimately, what gets exciting about this time, and I think about this in light of things we've discussed on Event Horizon and things you and I have discussed, when we came out of the retreat, we were inundated by the insanity of the world and what's been happening ever since then. You look at what's happening in terms of wars and rumors of wars. Again, think about scriptural traditions there. End times that people are postulating are underway as we speak. You can easily get overwhelmed and feel like there's no way out. But simultaneously, life itself, or the cosmos, or we ourselves at some higher fractal level, seem to be introducing experiences and anomalies, sometimes in the form of non-human intelligences, that are driving deeper integration to get us out of this pickle. So if we're going to ride the metaphysical stallions anywhere, Nathan, that feels like a good place to go.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. The activity that we see all around us, right? The kind of manic froth that we're experiencing in the world right now. It is the activity, the movement of consciousness itself. And in that movement, we find ourselves at a kind of location. There is a kind of moving from and to. And as you move from and to somewhere, you have this confrontation. You have this transition. You cross a threshold. And the threshold that you cross has a kind of objective reality to it. As you navigate that terrain, you're confronted with these new landscapes, these new beings, these new objects, and I've got to find a way to still get where I want to go. But these new things that arise in the experience, they transform my understanding of the journey itself, right? And so as we find ourselves in civilization today, confronting all of these various phenomena, and that's because of our explorations, right? We've pushed against the boundaries of our philosophies and our models. And as we've pushed against those boundaries, we've found that the models themselves have become inadequate. And it's not that they were never adequate, right? They had plenty of adequacy for a very long time. But now they have become inadequate. And in that discovery, we are now confronted with a radical transformation that must take place. But what I find cool about that is it's not only happening in a linear way, as we often kind of think about, I'm getting from point A to point B, but it's happening in a multidimensional way. So this is occurring not only at the level of the self, but the level of, as you say, the oversoul, at the level of society, at the subconscious. We have all kinds of terms for this, but this is an experience. This is experiential, and experience doesn't necessarily conform to linear rules. And if you've been in an exchange, or you've had one of these altered state moments, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The rules, the conventional rules, no longer apply. And when we talk about this, I love the term, the plural ontology of UAPs, that they're technological, but they're also conscious. There are aspects of consciousness. Well, as you and I know, it's all consciousness. So it's just a matter of vantage point. Anyway, very, very exciting stuff to explore. And I think it takes more than, a podcast or a session or a retreat, and honestly, for every person, every lived experience, it's going to manifest in different ways, which I find really cool. So if you can tap into not only the movements within yourself, but also the movements that are occurring in everyone around you, then you learn something new, because their experiences are your experiences, because it's all taking place in that one singular subjectivity.
Absolutely. And the final point I'll leave people with is just an invitation, and it's an experiential invitation to discovering these deeper understandings of the self and of the nature of reality, mediated by radical transparency, by practicing radical transparency. The irony is that we all are, to some degree, hiding from ourselves and from each other. And the way that distorts the field is the very thing that prevents us from tapping in to this deeper understanding, that provides a kind of metaphysical comfort when you start recognizing that I cannot be destroyed. I cannot die, because I'm not something that was created to begin with. I am everything. I am part of universal mind, like you said, taking on a particular vantage point that's useful, that's helpful, that's purpose-driven, but is ultimately temporary. And that when we can both experience this to the max, like really drink from the fullness of what it means to be a human being at this time, knowing that we chose to be here, but we can simultaneously recognize we are the oversoul, and at an even higher fractal level, we are source itself, exploring just for the sake of the dance, and to enjoy that, and to develop this strange, uncanny ability to both see and be, to some degree, overwhelmed by what's happening in our world from a certain point of view, but understanding at a deeper level and a higher overarching perspective that even those polarities that show up as darkness and light are what consciousness uses to create greater integration and even more profound experience ultimately. So to recognize you are all those things simultaneously is the path, and radical transparency is what gets us there.
These are the wonderful things I love about Liminal Phrames. So I hope that those of you listening have enjoyed this conversation. It's been really good for me to kind of unpack this with you, Darren, and I look forward to the next one. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.